good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we're diving into one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world, the story of Atlantis. What was this fabled city said to be? Was it a real civilization lost to the sea or a myth created to teach a lesson? And why has the story captured imaginations for over 2,000 years? From Plato's writings to centuries of speculation, the tale of Atlantis has been told as a paradise that fell through greed, a warning from the gods, and even as a hidden piece of forgotten history. We'll explore where the story began, what the ancient sources actually say, and how it grew into one of the greatest legends of all time. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Now let's begin. They say the story begins with a god who loved a lonely hill. There was an island set beyond the straits. The old sailors called the Pillars, where the ocean ran broad and blue, and the wind smelled of cedar and salt. In the middle of that island rose a low rise of red earth and living rock. A young woman named Cleito lived there, the last of her line, a quiet keeper of her father's house. When Poseidon walked the world, he found her, and the sea god set his heart upon that hill, as if it were a jewel that the waves could not reach. The god circled the place with his power. He set the land in rings so that no one could come to Plato unless he willed it. From the hill out to the shore, he cut furrows with his trident and filled them with cedar, 3 bright mows under the sunday. Between these he left 2 rings of firm soil, good earth for a path and for watch posts. The work was clean and complete, like a master mason marking courses on the first day of a palace. From the air, it would have looked like ripples from a stone dropped upon a pond, perfect circles pressed into the island and held in place by a god's stubborn will. Inside the innermost ring, Poseidon made a home for Cleito. He planted a grove where the shade never failed, and the wind spoke softly through leaves that seemed to remember him. He brought forth 2 springs from the bedrock, one warm and one cold. The warm water steamed in the blue mornings and soothed tired limbs at night. The cold ran clear and sweet, fit to drink without fear. People who lived in the outlying farms in later years would say that the springs made the bread taste better and the wine last longer, and that was a small kind of miracle that even a doubtful man could accept. From that house and that marriage came children, 10 sons in 5 pairs. The eldest was Atlas, tall and grave, with a voice that carried. Poseidon gave the whole island to Atlas for his birthright, and named him first among brothers. The ocean that wrapped every coast took the name of the boy, and sailors who steered by stars and memory called those waters Atlantic long after the god went silent. To the other sons, the god gave portions of land and the duty to keep faith with their brother. They would rule as princes, but bend the knee when the eldest spoke. This order was not only law, it was blood, and it set the tone for what the island would become. The land answered this, beginning with abundance that even a careful mind might call uncanny. The earth was rich and dark, where the rivers touched it, and light and sandy under the pines, and both kinds of soil gave freely. Barley and wheat rose in soft waves. Vines took hold and thickened on the trellises until the grapes hung heavy and sweet. Orchards of fig and apple gave fruit by the basket. And the olive trees learned the patience of long years, and paid that patience back with oil that kept lamps alive through winter nights. In the uplands, there were forests with timber straight, enough for the longest beams. On the lower slopes, there were reeds and rushes and a white stone that cut to a clean face. Herds wandered the pastures and found grass even in the late season. There were wild things in plenty, and they left their trace along the streams. Old hunters told stories of animals with broad tusks and slow anger that crushed saplings to leave paths of their own making. Whether those tales were true or not, the soil itself could have been an altar. It gave and asked for very little in return. Atlas and his brothers could have lived modestly in such a place. For a while they did. They took the god's order as a charge, not a license. They built in wood first, and in stone only when it was needed. They set their dwellings near the central hill, and used the rings as the god had intended as guard and boundary, a way to measure distance and a way to remember who had made it safe. They crossed the water in small boats with poles and paddles. And they kept to the channels where the current ran smooth. They did not raise walls of pride in those first years. They raised shrines at the center. They kept a precinct for Poseidon and for Cleito, who had been his first love in that place. The precinct had no gold yet and no brazen roof. But people brought the best of what they had. A carved beam that showed the god with a fish in his hand. A bowl of lapis that caught the morning light. A ring made by a smith who had learned to coax a red metal from the dark veins that threaded the island's stone. That metal shone like a smoldering coal, and kept its color in salt air. In time, men would call it oracle calm and weigh it with the reverence they gave to gold. Here at the beginning, it was a marvel and a promise. The island underfoot held wealth that was more than grain or timber. It held a future that glittered when the sun moved across the sky. Poseidon's sons did not live as kings on thrones in that first season. They lived as stewards under the eye of a father who could be gentle and terrible in the same tide. Atlas learned to sit with a map scratched on a board and a reed pen in his hand, while the others brought reports of fields and cattle and boats. The map had the hill at its heart with the rings drawn around it. The lines were both answer and question. How do you cross them without breaking what they mean? How do you open a way for trade without opening a way for harm? The brothers spoke in turn, and Atlas heard them and decided where the next bridge would be built and where the next growth should grow. Untouched. In such small choices, a realm is born. Visitors came in ones and twos at first. A fisherman from a lesser island in search of new grounds. A trader with beads of amber from a northern coast. A sailor who swore that he had rounded the end of the world and come back again. They found no easy entry to the center. They were made to anchor at the outer ring and wait. The guards were courteous and answered with water from the cold spring and a heel of bread. A boy would bring a message inland and then bring a reply back. And some days the reply was no. It was a hard rule. But it kept the hill quiet, and the people learned that the center must be slow to open or else it would be lost. For a people who loved the sea, they respected the earth most of all. They laid out fields in long rectangles where the ground allowed, and along the river flats they dug straight channels that watered the crops by gravity alone. The father of one family would show his sons the way the water fell from one measure to the next, and the sons would learn to keep the silt clear and the banks strong. This was not the work of a gilded court. It was the work that fills the day and gives a full table at night. And yet there was a quiet grandeur in it. When the harvest came, the people gathered in the precinct and poured grain from the first sacks onto the temple floor. And the sound was like rain on a roof. Every year, the sea reminded them who they were. There were months when the swells came high and dark, and the harbors on the outer ring were no shield at all. The fishermen pulled their boats up beyond the reach of spray, and the families stayed inland and listened to the roar. When the storm passed, the sky would clear and the island would look washed and new. The rings would still be there, calm and bright, and the springs would still be flowing, one warm and one cold. The people would walk to the precinct barefoot on the wet ground and thank the god, because they were still on his island and he had not withdrawn his gift. So the beginnings of Atlantis were not riotous or wild. They were careful and deliberate. A god made a safe circle around a hill. A woman kept a home at its heart. 10 sons learned to love a place more than they loved glory. A small city grew up shore by shore around the calm center. In that calm, the future gathered its strength. Atlas came into his crown as a man steps into a room already full of light. The ground had been prepared by a god, and by steady hands. What he did was to keep that light from burning the house. His first acts were not grand gestures. He set laws, and he set a rhythm. He called his brothers to the central hill and told them what they already knew. Each would govern his portion. Each would owe tribute and loyalty to the High King. They would meet to judge one another, not to flatter. They would bring their quarrels to the temple and leave with their pride trimmed and their duty made plain. In such beginnings, the island took its measure. The city and the rings began to grow in a way that pleased both masons and sailors. The water passages were not a mere show of divine power. Atlas had bridges laid across the narrowest spans so that carts and cattle could pass from one belt of land to the next without a long detour. He ordered a broad canal cut from the outermost ring to the open sea so that a ship with a high prow could come in on a flood tide and find calm water behind the walls. The channel ran straight as an arrow and was kept deep with crews who knew how to read the mud. On the inner rings, he placed drawbridges that could be raised in a moment when trouble came. The harbor became a kind of lung for the city. Ships breathed in and out, and the life of the place moved with them. Stone soon gave the city its face. The quarries yielded 3 colors that pleased the eye. The builders set white stone where sunlight would strike. They set red stone in bands along arches and lintels. They set black stone deep in foundations and along the waterline where spray and salt would test it. The walls of the 3 great circuits were faced with metal. The far wall shone with bronze that took a good polish. The next gleamed with pale tin. The inner wall caught the sun like live embers because the masons had clad it in auriculum. Men did not agree on what auriculum truly was. Some called it a metal in its own right. Others said it was a master's alloy that married different OES. On Atlantis, no one argued. They had it in it, held its color in sea air, and it made a wall look like the horizon at dusk. Within the innermost ring, the kings raised a temple to Poseidon and to Plato. It stood large enough to make a man feel small, but not so large as to lose the sense of a shrine. The columns were sheathed with plates of the red metal. The roof took on a pale glow at sunrise because sheets of pale metal lay under the tiles. The floor was paved with white stone veined with blue like old ice. In the cellar stood the god. The statue showed Poseidon with his trident in one hand and a chariot at his back. The horses were in mid-step, and the sea seemed to move with them. Around the feet of the god ran a frieze that told the story of the 10 brothers taking their lands. Plato was set beside him with a hand lifted in blessing. When torches burned in that place, the gold leaf on the reliefs looked like firelight caught and held. Atlas ordered that the laws be set on a pillar of aurical in the precinct. The pillar carried more than words. It bore the weight of the island's self-respect. When the 10 kings met by custom every 6th year and also every 5th year, they came crowned with branches cut in the sacred grove, and they hunted a bull in the court as their fathers had done. They did not take a penned animal. They chose one that could still break a man's leg. They swore by the god, by the pillar, and by the blood of the bull that they would rule justly, keep faith, and punish any king who broke the law. It made a sober spectacle, the smell of warm blood, the salt sting of burning meat, the 2 springs running a few steps away, one steaming in the cool air, and one so cold it numbed a hand. The sight carved a groove in memory. A man who had stood there once did not forget what he had promised. The plain beyond the ring city carried the weight of the realm. Atlas had the engineers map it like a game board so water could be made to serve without waste. They cut straight canals to carry timber down from the mountain and to carry grain from the fields to the harbor. They set barges on the river and simple locks with gates that could be worked by men with poles. The fields were laid in long rectangles with earthworks to hold back flood water in the wet months and to stretch the flow in the dry. Herds grazed in commons that were measured and recorded. Forests were cut by rule, and the rule was strict. No beam for a palace unless the same stand planted twice as many saplings as had been felled. This was not pious talk. It was practice. In a generation, the law paid back what it had demanded. The island's belly held metal and stone enough for a great many plans. The miners brought out copper and tin and a quality of black stone that took a keen edge. From the deeper seams, they brought the red metal that the jewelers and armorers loved. At first, it went to the temple and the pillar and the inner wall. Later, it worked its way into the life of the city. You could stand in the market at midday and see the red glimmer in rings and buckles, in the rims of bowls, in the fittings of scabbards, in the nails that bound a prow plank to the ribs of a ship. The smiths taught apprentices how to heat and fold the metal so it did not crack when the weather turned. When the first storms of the season blew over the harbor, the red fittings held. Order ran down through the ranks as water runs down terraces. Each of the 9 princes under Atlas kept a muster of men, a record of fields and flocks, and a tally of tribute. They came to the central hill on appointed days and offered not only coin and goods, but an account of how the people lived. Atlas did not care for a pile of ingots. If the village that sent them had roofs with holes or a well-gone brackish, he could be exacting. He would send a brother back into the night with orders to mend a causeway or to cut a new channel before the next rains. He held glory at a distance and kept usefulness close. Daily life in the ring city followed the lines of this thought. The builders laid out stoves and markets where a man could trade for grain and fish and good salt without being jostled by wagons. They set the smiths in one quarter where the air already tasted of charcoal so that the rest of the city would not choke. They put the tanners downwind and kept the potters near the clay pits. The schools were set on higher ground where the breezes kept the heat from settling. They're the sons and daughters of farmers. And sailors learned to reckon, to read, and to draw the simple maps that told them irrigation from flood and harbor from Shaw. Atlas made it a law that the first fruits of the vintage and the first measures of grain be brought to the precinct. It kept the temple full, and it taught the people to think of harvest as a shared fortune, not a private miracle. Festivals kept the old reverence alive, without dulling it with fear. On the day of the springs, the people carried bowls of the warm water and the cold and poured them together on the steps before the god. They said it made the mind remember both comfort and sharpness. On the day of ships, the harbor mouth was decked with garlands, and the old rowers took to the oars again, while the children beat time on shields. On the day of laws, the pillar was washed and polished until you could see your face in it. The kings read out the oldest lines so that the words would bite again. Men who had forgotten the weight of them found their hands tightening at their sides. Warfare did not preoccupy this early court, but readiness was woven into the grain of the city. The broad ring of water nearest the outer wall served as a racecourse for horses and for the training of chariots. There a team could learn to take a curve without breaking a wheel or a neck. On the flat plain beyond, companies drilled with spear and shield. The harbor held ships under roofed sheds carved into the stone so planks would not rot and sails would not mildew. The masters kept lists of OES and rigging. They knew how long it would take to fit out a squadron. They knew which crews were short and which boats took water at the seams. No one mistook this quiet preparation for weakness. Peace is kept by people who are able to stand when it is tested. The wealth that the philosophers later wrote about had already begun to settle into the bones of the realm. Warehouses filled along the outer ring. Granaries held a portion of every harvest against lean years. The coiners worked plain designs with the head of Poseidon or the sign of the pillar. Tribute from the provinces began to arrive as well, for the island was already reaching across the water to nearby shores with trade and with settlements that kept faith with the center. Amber and tin came from the far coasts. Fine linen and incense came from the warm lands. Nearer the sunrise, the island gave timber, crafted goods, good metal, and a sure harbor in return. A balance was kept and measured. Above all, a certain temper of mind held. The kings still wore simple wool at the judging as a reminder of their place. Atlas kept his house in the inner ring large enough for work and guests, but not so large as to make a man forget that a temple stood a few hundred paces away. When a foreign prince sent a gift too rich by far, the high king would pass a portion of it to the precinct or to the shipyards. Priests kept their bellies thin and their eyes clear. Craftsmen were praised by name in the precinct when they had solved a stubborn problem of weight or water. Farmers who had brought a new terrace into service were called forward at the same ceremony. People learned what the realm admired, and they shaped their lives to match it. There were omens and small wonders that folk remembered in the telling. On the longest day of one year, the warm spring ran a little hotter at noon, and the cold spring ran a little colder at dusk. The old women said the god had spoken in his own quiet way. The same summer, a school of large fish moved into the ring water and stayed for 3 days. Children leaned over the parapets to watch their slow circuit. The soldiers laughed and said, even the fish understood the idea of a wall. The harvest that followed was strong. Men nodded and gave thanks and did not try to prove anything with it. Years like these make a people think they are doing something right. Perhaps they were. The island under Atlas held to a straight course. Laws had a bite. Engineers had respect. Priests remembered that they were servants. Wealth moved where it was needed. The temple shone, but did not blind. When visitors asked how such order could be kept, the old men pointed to the pillar and to the rings of water and stone and said that it was best to remember your center and to keep the paths to it guarded and clear. The ring city did not grow by accident. It grew the way a careful mason lays course upon course and never forgets the line. The sea had already drawn the first circles. Atlas and his builders taught stone and timber to repeat that shape until the rings felt like the ribs of a living thing. At the outer approaches, a broad canal cut through the literal sand and met the ocean. It was straight and deep and marked by stone beacons, so that even in fog a pilot who kept his nerve could feel his way inward. The mouth was wide enough for 2 merchantmen to pass without scraping their oars. Tide and current did the heavy lifting. Crews with poles and ropes did the rest. The canal ran to the first ring of water where quays and landing steps turned the rim into a necklace of docks. Sailors learned to love that harbor. The swell that frightened men on the open water was gentled by the rings, and a boat could ride easy while the city moved around it. Across the water rings, the king set bridges with clean spans and stout piers. The piers were faced with black stone that shrugged off spray. The parapets were capped with bronze that took a polish and kept its shine. A man could walk from outer ring to inner ring and feel the city tighten around him with each crossing. There were drawbridges close to the center. They could lift and time it. Took a rider to gallop from one watch to the next. In peace they stayed down. In trouble, they made the water wide again. The 3 great walls carried the city's pride on their faces. The far wall showed bronze plates fixed with rivets that were flush to the touch. Sunlight turned that belt into a warm band at morning and evening. The next wall wore tin that looked pale at noon and took on the color of the sky at dusk. The inner wall had the red metal that travelers remembered when they told their hosts at home what they had seen. The plates were set over good stone and bound with clamps of copper. The joints were so fine you could not fit a knife's tip between them. Guards walked the tops where tiles kept the rain off the patrol. Below stairs cut into the thickness of the wall led to doors that opened onto the bridges and onto the quays. You could move men faster along those stairs than a trumpet could carry a note. Stone from the island gave the builders 3 voices to work with. White blocks came from a quarry near the river bend. Red stone came from the low hill north of the precinct. Black stone came from a seam that ran down to the shore. The masons set them so that courts and porticos carried bands of color that were handsome but never loud. The same care ordered the streets. The mainways ran in gentle curves to meet the bridges. Cross streets cut them at right angles on the land rings. Drains ran beneath with enough fall to carry storm water out to the sea. When rain came hard, the water left the streets quickly and did not linger to rot timber or sour the market air. The inner ring carried the heart of the realm. The precinct to Poseidon and Cleito stood there in measured grandeur. Ivory and gold gleamed in the darkness. Within, the statue of the sea god rose above a basin that caught the light of oil lamps. He held the trident and drove a chariot whose horses seemed to be rising through waves. Around the base, metal workers had set a band of red plates that did not dull no matter how many lamps smoked before them. The roof timbers were cedar that the carpenters had seasoned for years. The columns carried carvings of dolphins and bulls and grains and vines. The floorstones were laid in a pattern that drew a visitor forward step by careful step until he stood beneath the god with his head bowed without, knowing when he had lowered it. Near the precinct, the palace quarter gathered around courtyards open to the Sunday long halls for judgment, and feasts were set with colonnades. Rooms for council opened, one into another, so that the business of a day could flow without confusion. The palace was not a fortress. The walls were strong, but the strength came from placement rather than from thickness. The builders trusted the rings to break an army, and they trusted the laws to hold brothers ready to act before an enemy grew bold. Water gave the city its ease, from the hot spring and the cold spring near the central hill. Channels and pipes carried clean flow to baths and fountains. The warm water found the bath precincts where laborers ended their day, and officers eased bruised legs. After training, the cold water fed public fountains and systems that never ran dry. In summer, the fountains drew children and the old. In winter, the baths sent steam into the street and softened the bite of wind. The stewards kept tablets that named every valve and every sleigh. When a line needed clearing, a team arrived with brushes and poles before a householder had finished his complaint. Ship sheds were carved into the outer ring's inner face where the stone allowed it. Under those roofs, a try could rest without rot and wait for its next season. Hinged doors opened to the water and closed against salt spray. Rope makers worked in a long lane that had been measured for that purpose. Sail makers had a court wide enough to spread canvas flat. Carpenters kept a tally of seasoned planks against the day when a keel split or a rib failed under strain. The Navy was a daily labor and not a parade. A visitor could see that in the hands of the men and in the lists cut into the wood of the sheds. The ring nearest the outer wall held the markets. Fish came there on wet tables that sloped toward drains. Grain in sacks reached the same quarter by barge down the field canals. Potters stacked jars taller than a man. Smiths sold nails by weight and knives by feel. Jewelers showed ornaments of the red metal and told buyers how the color would hold bright even at sea. The stalls had awnings to blunt the Sunday. The ground was swept by boys who were paid in bread and a cup of watered wine. Thieves found no welcome. The watch kept order with a firm patience that made violence a last resort. Horses had their place as well. The broad ring of water closest to the wall served in part as a course. A team in a chariot could run around it and learn how to take turns without skidding a wheel. Stables stood where the wind kept flies down. Grooms kept a book of feed and gait and harness. Inspections were held at set times. Men who passed the exam wore a badge with the king's mark and were permitted to race before the pillar during the festivals. The plain outside the rings answered the same order. Canals crossed it like a net so that any field lay within reach of water and of transport. Barges brought timber from the mountains and sheave from the farms. The banks were planted with willow to hold the earth. Locks were simple but serviceable. A pair of gates, a spillway, and a chain dropped across when repairs were needed. The road that ran beside the main canal stood on a raised bed that stayed dry in the wet season. It was tamped hard. and edged with stone where carts would have cut ruts. Travelers could move with speed that surprised those who had only known river mud and mountain track. The city did not forget watchfulness as it grew beautiful. The chiefs of the guard walked the walls and counted the lamps at each post. The fire watch in the palace quarter kept buckets and hooks ready and staged practice in the off hours. When the cooks were idle, the harbor kept a signal pole where flags could tell a captain if the inner bridges were up and if the docks were full. A ship that arrived at sunrise knew by noon where it would take on water and where it would lie for the night. The kings prized that level of forethought. It saved tempers. It saved money. Sometimes it saved lives. Visitors felt the force of it without being told. The rings pressed their sense of order into every hour. You ate. You traded. You prayed. You trained, and you slept in places that had been chosen for those things. No one needed to shout. The shape itself did the talking. A farmer could carry his olives to the press and know the road, the price, and the time before he stepped out his door. A captain could bring his ship up the canal and know the width of the passage before he had even sighted the bronze plates of the first wall. A stranger could stand at the center and look out and understand in his bones why the city had the strength to grow rich. It was splendid. There is no other honest word for it. The splendor did not come from excess. It came from precision and from an instinct for restraint that made later opulence possible. The builders who set those stones and those bridges may not have thought of pride when they worked, but pride was growing all the same. Pride rides quietly when a city fits its shape, and the people fit their work, and the gold on the walls looks like sunlight rather than greed. A city can be read by the way it spends the morning. In Atlantis, the first hour belonged to the harbor. Before the sun cleared the outer wall, boys with broom and basket swept the quays. Lanterns burned low in doorways where a scribe sat with a tablet and a reed pen. He took the names of ships and the names of captains and marked their cargo in neat columns. One line for timber and pitch, one line for grain and olives, one line for fish packed in salt. Dock masters stood at the head of each pier with a staff in hand and a whistle on a cord. They placed each hull where it would not block another and counted barrels as they came ashore. A man could see the city think with its hands. The markets woke next. Fishmongers spread reeds on the tables and laid out the catch by size and kind. The smell was not a rot, but a clean sea smell, and it brought coins out of purses. Bakers broke the blackened crust on the first loaves, and the steam ran down their wrists. The bread was made from barley on poor days, and from wheat when the harvest was strong. It was eaten with olives or with cheese from the mountain pastures. Vinegar stood in small bowls on the counters, and men dipped bread in it to sharpen their appetite. Women bartered for copper pins and plain cups of clay. Children chased one another through the colonnades until a storekeeper snapped his fingers and sent them outside to race along the parapet where they could do no harm. Not far from the quays, the smiths made their own dawn. Charcoal caught with a dry whisper and then roared when the bellows blew. The best forges had a faint red cast from the fittings set in the door and from old work hung on pegs. The smiths kept 2 jars near the anvil. One held water to temper, and the other held oil for pieces that needed a kinder cooling. The hammer blows were steady, and the rhythm carried along the lane from one shop to the next. In Atlantis, it was common to see the red metal in small things, a clasp on a cloak, a buckle on a horse, a line of inlay on a cup that made noon feel special a day. Poor table. The pride of the city showed in those touches as much as in the plates on the walls. The streets were built to move grain as much as people. Carts used the outer rings until they reached the quays that stood like notches on a wheel. From the countryside, barges came along the canals with their loads covered in woven mats. A foreman walked the bank and kept the rope taut while the mule leaned into the collar. The bargeman had a pole to test the depth and a rake to clear weed at the bends. In dry months, the locks gave a little water here and took a little there to keep the flow even. The canal wards were proud of the way they could send timber from the hills straight to the ship sheets without once rolling a log on the road. Law was not a word in a speaker's mouth. It was a set of steps a person took through his day. The courts stood in long halls on the inner ring shaded by colonnades. A citizen could walk in and tell his grievance to a clerk who would mark the names and the charge. The judges were chosen by the kings, but owed their honor to the pillar, not to a purse. The usual penalty was a fine, or a number of days of work on a public project. A repeat offense brought a heavier hand, and sometimes an exile that bit deep. Men feared exile more than the whip. A man who was put outside the rings lost not only his house, but the rhythm that brows and robes that were free of ornament. They hunted a bull within the precinct. It was not a cruel spectacle. It was a test that marked the passage from oath to action. They swore over the blood on the stones that they would keep the laws as written on the red pillar. They pledged to judge their brothers if need demanded it. A king who failed the law could be stripped of his honors and of a portion of his land. The story says it happened more than once. The island learned early that there is no quicker way to rot than to excuse the powerful. The days were not all work and rule. The calendar held its own shape. On the day of ships, painted banners hung from the outer wall, and a procession of crews walked through the city with OES held upright on their shoulders. On the day of the springs, the people brought jars from both fountains to the steps of the temple and poured them together so that steam rose in the morning light. On the day of the games, the broad ring of water near the wall became a track. Chariots ran in pairs on the path beside it, and teams changed places like birds turning in the sky. Wrestlers fought on packed earth with oil on their shoulders. Runners went around the rings until the crowd shouted the winner forward to touch the pillar with his hand. A prize might be a wreath or a cup or the right to stand at the king's table for one feast. The honor mattered more than the gift. Education was a common duty. Children learned numbers and letters in rooms that breathed the sea breeze. They drew the plan of the rings on wax tablets until they could do it with their eyes closed. They learned the names of the winds and how to judge a harbor by the set of the current and the color of the water. The sons of shipwrights could name timbers by sound when tapped with a mallet. The daughters of merchants could reckon a cargo and spot a false weight in a moment. Priests taught the old hymns and the stories that lay under the city like a foundation. Mariners taught the younger ones how to find the pole star and how to keep a course when the sky went to rain. The house was the kernel of the city. Most homes were built around a small court with a system. The floor was packed clay in poor rooms and stone in rooms where an older hand had worked. A household might hold 3 generations. There was a loom in a cool corner and a mortar set near the door where a wife or a daughter would grind grain while the morning was fresh. A shelf held cups and a lamp and a small figure of Poseidon or of a household spirit. When a child was born, the father would set a dish of honey by the tiny altar and ask for a steady breath and a strong back in the years to come. When someone died, the family washed the body with water from the cold spring and watched through the night, telling stories that had teeth and laughter both. Food was simple and good. Fish and barley bread made the daily meal. On a better day, there was goat or kid stewed with onions and herbs. On the days after a festival, there might be beef in pieces handed out from the precinct, for the sacrifice fed the people as well as the god. Oil and figs sweeten life. Wine watered for common use and strong for rites. Salt from the pans beyond the fields. Honey from the hives kept under time and sage on the sunny slopes. A visitor who stayed a week would come to believe that the island itself had learned how to feed a table with nothing wasted. Crafts gave Atlantis its polish. The potters knew a slip that fired to a low shine and took red paint without bleeding. The carvers could turn a piece of black stone into a seal that pressed a ship on wax so cleanly that you could count the planks. The weavers learned to make a tight cloth for sail and a soft cloth for robe and a colored border that told a family's name at a distance. Money went into such things with a calm hand. The kings did not dress like peasants. They preferred cloth that spoke in low voices. They wore rings and collars that showed the red metal in ways that were felt more than seen. A court that knows how to speak softly in these matters is a court that can live through years of plenty without losing its wits. The navy and the army were not hungry mouths that ate the city bare. They were trades that kept other trades alive. Shipwrights passed down measures by memory and rule. OES were paired by weight. Sails were folded and salted and folded again. Captains taught green crews to keep time by song so that the stroke would not wander when the water was rough. On land, the drill fields took men in harvest slack and sent them home when the season turned. Spears were stored point down in racks under eaves where rain could not reach. Shields hung clean on pegs. A city that can put a wall of wood on the water in a day is a city that draws respect without needing to draw the sword. Foreigners found welcome and rule in equal parts. Guest houses stood near the outer ring and were kept clean. Interpreters sat with the scribes at the quays and earned their keep by ease of tongue. Customs took a fair slice and no more. A cheating captain could expect to go home without his cargo and with his ship under seal. An honest trader could expect a clean ledger and a cup of wine at the end of the day. Many came back simply for the relief of knowing what they faced. You can build a reputation that is better than gold if you keep your word on the dull days as well as on the feasts. Not everything was perfect. Pride came in small choices. A merchant added a second ring to a finger. A magistrate allowed his son to skip drill without cause. A prince asked the armorist to set more red metal on his harness than was strictly needed. A court singer composed a hymn that praised a king's judgment more loudly than it praised the god. None of these were crimes. Each had a little weight. A people who have never been brought low learn slowly that weight adds up. There were also moments that felt like mercy. On a summer night, the dolphins came up the canal and swam in the first ring until lanterns reflected in their backs. The next morning, the cold spring tasted sweeter than usual, and an old woman swore she could feel the god's hand on her shoulder when she crossed the court. On the shortest day, a solitary storm cloud stood above the temple like a column and dropped its rain only on the precinct stones. A priest lifted his face and said that the god kept us clean when we could not keep ourselves. People nodded without making a fuss. They went home and mended their nets. When the day closed, the city wound itself down with the same care it used to wake. Gates to the inner bridges were shut, and the watch lit the lamps on the parapets. Scribes stacked their tablets and covered them with linen and weighed the corners with small stones. Children washed their hands in a basin and lay on mats near the cool wall and asked a last question before sleep. In the precinct, the priests banked the fires and left a single lamp before the god. The air carried smoke from the baths and the distant sea salt and the faint scent of pressed grapes from a wine shop, not yet closed. It was a good smell. It held work and honor and the pleasant weariness that comes from both. Such was the life that grew out of the rings and the laws and the springs. A city that believed in its own measure and trusted the slow virtues. A people whose pride was quiet, and for the moment that kind was the most dangerous of all, because it did not look like pride when you were living inside it. Decline came softly, the way a tide turns while you are looking at something else. A generation had grown up that did not remember the rough work of the first canals or the winters when olives were counted one by one. They had known only fat years, bright metals, and a city that answered them before they could think of what to ask. When a people live long in ease, they come to believe that the world has agreed to their comfort. The ring city began to put more light on itself. What had been handsome became grand. The bronze of the outer wall was polished every week until men could see their faces in it from the quays. The tin of the middle wall shone with a pale fire at noon. The inner plates of the red metal took the sunset and gave it back like embers stirred by a bellows. Houses in the better quarters learned to copy these things. A shopkeeper who had once been content with white stone asked a mason to set a strip of red in his lintel. A magistrate ordered bronze caps for his stair posts. A prince had the rims of his shields faced with the red metal simply because he liked the way the light ran along the edge when he turned it in his hand. At court the banquets lengthened. The old custom had been to eat well after judgment and to dismiss the singers before midnight, so that the palace did not forget it was also a place of work. That hour grew later. Musicians learned songs that praised the king by name. Dishes came from far coasts and relied more on distance than on taste. There were roasted birds that a hunter could not catch within 10 days of the city. There were sauces made from fish that lived in waters warmer than any the island knew. Young men who had never known a hungry year learned to laugh at the priests who asked for restraint. They called restraint a virtue for poor tables. The hunt changed too. The king still took the bull in the precinct when they swore by the pillar, but fewer bulls came from the wild. A prince who could afford it would keep a fine animal in a field and have it driven into the court for the right. Old men remembered when a king had blood on his ankles and dust in his teeth before he made his oath. Now there were days when the blood that ran over the stones seemed to smell of fodder and not of fear. The priests spoke of it quietly among themselves. They saw the way a symbol takes on warmth when it is earned and turns cold when it is bought. The law remained written in the red pillar, but the law and practice began to bend. A judge who had once been known for a strict hand now found reasons to postpone the judgment of a noble house. Fines that had supported the canal wards, and the roads were forgiven with a smile. A foreign captain who had been caught shaving his waits was fined lightly because he brought incense that the palace favored. Men told themselves that a small wrong could be spared when it served a larger good. They had not yet learned how fast a small wrong becomes a custom. Wealth moved in new ways. Coins that had circulated from hand to hand began to settle in vaults. Lenders appeared who would write a neat contract and charge for time. A farmer who had taken a loan against a poor harvest found himself paying with the next one too. The granaries still filled, but the share set aside for lean years grew harder for a poor man to reach. The first fruits brought to the precinct were still enough for the rights. They were not so generous that a stranger would come away believing that the city belonged to the god. The navy grew splendid. Rams were faced with a broad band of the red metal. Ships carried carved prows that turned the heads of children on the quays. Crews still drilled, but there were afternoons when a captain kept his men on the benches longer than was wise, so that a visiting prince could hear the oars rise and fall in perfect time. A fine sound, to be sure, but the men in the sheds who kept the lists knew which hulls rode heavy and which crews were short. They knew the difference between show and readiness. They could smell it. Trade widened. Ambassadors came with rich gifts from the coasts that lay nearest the sunrise and from the lands that lay beyond the sunset wind. They spoke in smooth voices about partnership, about protection, about tribute. The kings listened. The maps in the war room took on more marks. Where the lines had once named harbors and safe water, they began to name garrisons and ports of call, where a ship of Atlantis would expect a portion of the market for the favor of its presence. A proud city tells itself that such favors are the same as friendship. The men who collect the coin know better. It is hard to tell a proud people that something is wrong when everything still looks right. The fields were green. The harbor was full. The walls gleamed. The festivals went on. The king still wore plain wool when they came to swear. The pillar was still red and hard, and took the breath from a man who came near it. Yet there were other signs that the old patience was thinning. A judge snapped at a Clare for bringing a case from the river wards that should have been settled with a coin and a handshake. A captain struck a sailor across the mouth for singing the rowing song a beat too fast. A prince frowned when a priest asked him to sit without his ring at the council table. Little things, and the city was full of little things. The story that later philosophers wrote is clean in its telling. They say that the godly portion in the blood of the kings grew thin, and the human portion swelled. The Atlanteans loved honor less and wealth more. They forgot the law of their father and valued the ring walls for their beauty rather than for the duty those walls set. On the island itself, the change would not have been so clear. It would have felt like tiredness after a long day, a softness in the hand that once held firm, a desire to be praised before the work was done. Ambition sharpened in quiet rooms. There were councils that met at odd hours without the full company, and made plans that were presented later as settled fact. Out on the plain, new roads appeared with a speed that did not match their necessity. Garrisons were raised where the threat was faint. Taxes were set in the provinces with a heavier touch. A few island families came to own 2 houses and 3 warehouses when one had served their fathers well enough. A few country houses began to look like little courts with a private bath and a private singer and a table that drew more guests than a village feast. There were warnings in the earth as well, though a man could forgive himself for not heeding them. The island shivered in a way that made doors creak and lamps tremble. The tremors were small and did no harm. Children laughed and clapped when the cups danced on the table. Men remembered that the ground has a sleeping strength and told themselves that a stirring now and then meant only that it was sound. The sea ran higher in one winter and chewed a little more at the dunes beyond the fields. The canal wards set more willow in the banks and told the kings that a few more hands in the wet season would keep the water in its place. The kings nodded and marked a note for later. In such a season, the city had 2 minds. One mind stood in the precinct and remembered the god who had given the springs and the rings and the laws. The other mind stood in the war room and looked past the pillars toward lands where the maps had been left pale for lack of time. Both minds called themselves loyal. Both spoke of duty. Each began to forget that duty can pull a man in 2. Whatever the reason, the ease of the early years was gone. The city still had splendor. It had added pride. Pride by itself is not a sin. The old teachers said it becomes one when it no longer remembers what it is proud of. A people can forget faster than any single man. Their memory is housed in customs and ceremonies and in the way a thing is done year after year. Change the way quietly. Enough and the memory goes with it. So the shadows lengthened while the streets were still bright. The warnings stood in plain sight and yet were hard to hear because the markets were noisy and the wine was good and the singers had learned a new song about the way the inner wall burns red at sunset. There were men and women who felt the unease but could not give it a name. They were like sailors who smell the weather but cannot yet point to a cloud. You could walk the bridges and look down at the ring water and see the reflection of the temple as steady as ever. You could stand there and imagine that the surface shows everything that matters. It seldom does. The change from patience to hunger began with a map. In the palace council room, the long table was cleared and a board was brought in that showed the known sea from the pillars out to the sunrise lands. Harbors were marked in ink. Currents were marked with thin lines that curved like vines. Along the margins, scribes added notes that a captain would understand at a glance. Where to find fresh water, where the wind veered in late summer, where a reef waited to open a careless hull. The kings had always kept such charts. Now the marks began to drift inland. Names of towns appeared beyond the beaches. Grain tallies, herd counts. The number of men of spear age that a village could send if called. It was a quiet way of saying that the sea no longer satisfied the island's reach. Councils met more often and at later hours. The talk had the feel of a tide that is turning. Governors from the provinces sent word of quarrels on the far coasts. A prince spoke of a harbor that had refused to pay the old fees and had sent envoys to a rival city instead. A sea captain told of raids on a friendly shore by men who wore their hair in a different fashion and carried shields with a crooked cross. Each report was small by itself. Together they drew a picture of a world that was not going to sit still while Atlantis grew rich. The answer that gathered in the room was to make the world sit still. Orders went out that had the taste of readiness in them. The ship sheets were told to bring every triumph to sound would before the end of spring. New keels were laid in the outer ring where a path of rollers ran from the fitting yard to the water. The oar masters walked the sheds with scales in hand and paired the oars by weight so that a crew would not fight its own stroke. Rope walks worked day and night to twist new rigging. Quartermasters checked the bronze nails in the bins and the spare rudders stacked along the walls. On the drill fields, the companies lengthened their practice. Men learned to ground spear and lift shield and move as a wall under a rain of stones. Officers grew hard in voice and eye. The city had always trained. Now it trained as if it expected to be judged. Diplomacy sharpened into something colder. Where a friendly harbor had once received a gift of oil and advice about pilots, the same harbor now received a visitor who spoke of protection and tribute in the same breath. A treaty that had been made on a festival day was brought out and read in a new tone. Lines that had been overlooked were given weight. A clause that named a price for shelter became a lever that named the shelter a garrison. When a coastal town borked, a squadron appeared beyond the outer bar and lay at anchor until the elders sent for the scribe and the seal. The phrase the governors used was order on the western road. In the markets, men said that the island had learned to hold a purse in one hand and a spear in the other. Money followed the spear. Tallies were kept of timber, pitch, and grain far from the central hill. A chain of storehouses appeared along the routes that mattered. Sailors could count on fresh water and new rigging at certain points and could name the man who held the keys. Inlands. Way stations were set where a courier could change horses and keep riding until night had turned twice. The kings kept a list of such stations and their keepers and checked it after every festival. A realm that wants to move quickly must learn to do so in small steps long before it runs. Spies learn to sail. Not the knife men of a poor tale, but merchants with good bargains and a clean way of speaking. They came to Greek harbors with fine cloth and a better price, and asked questions in the evenings over wine in the taverns that faced the sea. How many young men did the city send to row each year? How long did it take to fit a triumph when the alarm sounded? Which priest had the ear of the magistrates? And which magistrate had a son who preferred racing to drill? In Egypt, they watched the mouths of the river and the traffic that crowded the narrow channels. They learned which branch took barges to the granaries and which branch shipped soldiers when the crown was angry. They sent their notes home with traders who were paid a little more for the risk so that they could pretend they had simply made a better sail. Room across the sea as fast as any ship. In Athens, men who loved argument heard talk of a Western power that was measuring the world with a ruler and a spear. In Sicily, fishermen pointed out a squadron under half sail and said that they were Atlantean hulls by the cut of their bows. In the islands off the Peloponnese, a pilot claimed that a ship with red metal on its beak had chased him off a reef he had fished since his father's day. Some stories were lies told for the pleasure of telling them. Some were true in pieces. Altogether, they began to make a cloud that lay on the water when the wind was still. At home, the court dressed its ambition in the language of duty. The kings spoke of securing the sea lanes. They spoke of ending piracy and of keeping wheat moving from the river realms to the hungry coasts. Priests who had learned patience nodded when the words were spoken in the precinct. The maps on the board told the same story in a different tongue. Lines crept outward that linked harbors to garrisons and garrisons, to depots and depots, to new settlements of island families who would keep their law and worship in their way and send back the right portion at the right times. This is how a commonwealth becomes an empire. It does not announce itself. It arrives like a caravan at dusk and asks for a place to sleep. In the morning, it owns the stable and the yard and the road. There were debates that went into the night. Some at the council argued for caution. They spoke of the cost of holding too much coast and of the way a rower grows weary when he sees nothing but duty on the horizon. They reminded the kings that the old laws had been made to keep a city whole, not to make it large. Others spoke of the glory of a single law and a single peace. They said that the god had planted the springs to water, more than a small island. The council that leaves the room at dawn seldom remembers the objections of the few who asked for a slower hand. It remembers the phrases that held hope. The army began to change its shoes. Men who had drilled under the ring walls were marched to the plain and told to walk until a watchtower on the far edge looked near enough to touch. Engineers measured the days. March and marked on their tablets where a force could expect water and where it would be wise to rest. Stores of grain and salt meat were sealed in bins at set distances from the harbor. Teams of carpenters with broad axes were assigned to each cohort so that a palisade could rise before the second hour after sunset. Masons were sent ahead to shore up old walls on hills that overlooked the roads. The city was teaching itself to live away from the sound of its own fountains. Ships learned new habits as well. Captains practiced holding a line of battle at sea instead of racing for speed. Signal flags were drilled until even a green crew could turn on a command that came down the wind. The Admiralty experimented with heavier rams and with towers on decks from which archers could sweep a foe who had come too near. The new fittings were plated with the red metal because the court loved that look. Some old salts muttered that a ship ought to be more muscle and less ornament. They muttered it quietly. The new ships were fast enough and strong enough, and what they looked like pleased the kings. On the far shores, the first stores opened. A town that had long paid a small fee for shelter in a storm was told that the fee would now be permanent and would be called an arrangement. A governor placed an island magistrate in a hall where a local elder had long Saturday. The elder bowed and stood aside and went home to a house that felt smaller than it had the day before. In a river city, a garrison demanded the right to drill on the common and to keep a store of grain in the public granary against emergency. The emergency never came. The grain did not go back. Each of these changes was defended as minor and necessary. A traveler who visited only one place might not notice. The world is large. The pattern is what matters. Even while the empire took shape, the island told itself that it was acting with restraint. A prince could point to a town whose docks were safer because an Atlantean ship lay within sight. A merchant could count the coins saved because a known garrison warned off a band of sea raiders. A priest could say that the rites were better attended now, that order had come to a coast that had known only feuding. There was truth in such claims. There is often truth in the things we use to excuse ourselves. The Greeks listened in their porticos and their fish markets. They weighed pride against prudence. They had their own rivalries and memories of old slides. Some were tempted to welcome a power that promised quiet seas and predictable trade. Others spat on the ground and said that a quiet sea is a dead sea and that a people who let another write their laws deserve the sleep that follows. In the temples of Athena, men prayed for wisdom and strength. In the wrestling courts, boys watched the western horizon as if muscle and breath could give them news. A rumor needs an enemy, if it is to grow teeth. Atlantis was giving rumor an enemy that had a name and a face and a fleet. The island did not hide what it was doing. It could not. Ships and soldiers make noise. Drums of pitch roll loud on boards. New walls show their fresh-cut stone, even to a stranger. What Atlantis did instead was to believe that the scale of its power would make its purpose seem natural. The city had lived long with a sense of measure. Now that same sense of measure told it that more was the proper size for a realm that had outgrown its first limits. It is easy to mistake appetite for destiny when every plan you make comes together on time. The old teachers would have called this the hour before the storm. The streets were still bright. The pillars still shone in the lamplight. The spring still ran warm and cold. Beyond the rings, The lines on the council board had reached as far as the kings dared to trace them without starting a war. The last step was one they thought they could make with a steady foot and a steady hand. They forgot that the sea lives for moments when a steady hand is not enough. War began the way a storm begins, with a change in air that only the old fishermen feel in their bones. The council board that had shown routes and depots took on a new face. Lines once drawn for trade now carried the weight of marching orders. The admirals brought forward the tallies that they had kept in good times. How many crews were ready to row through a long day without losing the beat? How many hulls stood tight in their seams? How many spare oars lay in the racks? The quartermasters set out lists of salt, meat, grain, and pitch. The head of the rope walk named the length of new rigging he could deliver by the next moon. The figures did not sing. They spoke in a plain voice that said the island was ready to test what it had become. The summons went out to the 10 regions. Each prince sent his muster by canal and rowed to the ring city where the sheds and the wharves could swallow men and gear without a clog. The harbor that made a man love it on a calm day became a machine that moved. Triumphs slid into the light one after another with their rams newly burnished. Transport barges took on amphor of water and sacks of meal. Marines checked shields on the quay and tied their helmets to the straps of their cuirasses so that August would not claim them as a joke. Slingers counted the smooth stones in leather bags and ran a thumb over each one. Archers checked the binding of their bows and warmed their fingers over little braziers before the dawn watch. Orders were spoken by men who had drilled for this hour since they were boys. The first wave would go south and east along the familiar lanes across the western sea. The second would sweep toward the rich river country to show the flag and judge the banks. A third force would hold west of the pillars to keep jealous eyes from the heartland while the main business was done. The schedule read like a ledger tide in the second hour. Wind likely from the north before noon. Rest on the lee of the long island if the swells steepened after dusk. Sleep in watches. Keep the oars dry until called for speed. The fleet that left the outer canal in that season was the largest the island had ever put to water. Their orders steadied the heart. Warships in the van moved like shepherd dogs. Transports followed in good intervals so that a sudden shift in current would not drive one hull upon another. The admirals had placed their boldest captains on the outer flank and their compsed men at the center. Signal flags climbed and dropped on masts. The water between the rings barely stirred before the last ship cleared the mouth and felt the clean lift of the open sea. They made first for the long coasts around the western desert, where the green river cuts the brown land and spills its wealth into the sea. The island had traded there for generations. Now its captain stood off the mouths and counted the barges and the guards. They had names for the branches and could tell one from another by the color of the outflow and by the way driftwood turned. At the bars, the garrisons ashore watched the new arrivals and sent riders inland to the scribes who kept their own lists. When the envoy from Atlantis went ashore, he wore a plain cloak and a firm expression. He spoke of order on the sea lanes, of a fee that would bring patrols at need, of a treaty that had long been sleeping, among other papers. The local governors measured the speech against the ships they could see and made the choice that men make when they are not sure of tomorrow. They agreed to a levy and to a right of anchorage that let the island plant its first tokens on the river's lip. It was called friendship at the signing. It felt like a weight on the scale. From the river country, the first wave moved along the curve of the coast toward the islands that lie between the Sunrise Sea and the Great Gulf. There they found fishing towns and trade colonies that had long looked both ways when a taxman approached. A squadron stood off a harbor at dawn, and the sun showed red on the metal plates of the rams. On shore, the elders gathered with stiff backs and set faces. The admiral asked for pilots and stores. The elders asked what they would receive. In return, the answer was the same in each place. Safe water. A portion of the market. A garrison for a season only. The garrison left strong doors behind when it went. As the first wave fixed its anchor points, the second wave turned its eyes toward the Middle Sea. The charts in the island boardroom had traced old routes to the big islands and to the boot of the long peninsula. Those waters were thick with harbors that saw more wine than lore. Raiders made a living out of inlets that no foreigner could find twice. The islands sent fast hulls there with keen oarsmen and captains who liked to solve problems with their hands. In Sicily, they cut off a nest of pirates by chasing them into a bay with a narrow throat and then blocking the mouth with a line of ships tied stern to stern. When the trapped men tried to swim out at night, Marines met them in the water and pulled them aboard and gave them a choice that was not really a choice. Serve under rule or hang. From the yard arm with your knives still on your belts. By morning, the market heard that the island had brought calm to a coast that had forgotten the sound. Along the Tyrrhenian shores, they showed a different face. There were towns there that could send out men with round shields and short swords and a mind to use them. The island landed in good order with lines that had been measured on the drill field. Shield to shield, spear over spear. The first skirmishes gave them a taste of the local courage. No one slept easy for a few nights when word reached the captains that Hillford had sent a cloud of javelins into the camp and killed a dozen men whose names were well known. The response was patient and cold. Engineers threw up a ditch and a wall in a single day. Slingers stood behind the ditch and gave back the stones they had been greeted with. Only now they were shaped and smoothed. When the hillmen came down again, they found discipline waiting for them. Commanders walked the line afterward and touched the shoulders of the men who had held fast at the moment when such moments break a force. Those touches were worth more than coin for the rest of the campaign. By now, the clouds of rumor had thickened in the east. The islands off the Peloponnese had always been good watchers of the horizon. They reported a rhythm in the west that did not look like trade. Ships that kept formation, flags that repeated the same shapes in the same order, crews that sang in time even when the wind freshened and the seas grew short. Merchants who had argued politics over wine for years found themselves speaking softly when the name Atlantis came into the talk. Some hoped for lower tolls and quiet water. Others set aside coin to pay for spearheads and oil for the gymnasia. A city senses when it will be asked to decide what it is. The island councils had expected this attention. They meant to use it. Messengers went ahead of the second wave to the Greek coasts with phrases polished for temple steps and council stones. They spoke of common cause against sea bandits and of a reckoning to be made with petty tyrants who sold justice by the jar. They invited city elders to join a pact that would put an end to these brotherly quarrels. The invitation was a command in fine clothing. Those who replied with welcome saw a garrison build a fort on the hill above their harbor. Those who asked for time saw an anchorage chosen just beyond their headland where a squadron could rest as long as it pleased. Egypt kept a watch on all this with old eyes. The scribes in the river temples could count better than most men could see. They saw grain ships pass in good order and made a neat note when the hulls were escorted by vessels that wore the red metal like a badge. They saw the levy climb by a small measure in every port that had accepted the new pact. They also saw the way a foreign patrol makes itself at home along a quay. Men who have kept a record for 30 generations do not panic. They sharpen their quills and improve their memory. Their reports to the court spoke in the same careful hand that had named plagues and floods in other centuries. A new power rides the Western Sea. It has discipline and coin. It shows friendship and it keeps a ledger. The first true clash came when a Greek harbor refused to yield its winter customs house. The island magistrate arrived with a garrison and a contract. The local archon greeted him with full ceremony and shut the doors behind him. The admiral pulled his ships into the roadstead and showed his decks to the town. The archon sent boys to gather stones for the slingers and bade the women carry water to the walls. A quarrel that might have ended with words now had an audience and an arena. Shots were traded across the quay. A tried to force the narrow mouth and took a jar of burning pitch on its deck that made the crew jump into the water while they cursed. The sky. The island commanders brought up more ships and tried again as the light faded. The mouth was held. The island backed water and set a ring outside the harbor and waited for hunger to make its case. Word of the siege ran along the islands like lightning through dry grass. Some saw a lesson and sent envoys to cut a neat bargain before steel spoke. Others bristled and sent for men who could still hold a line in the dust on a summer morning. In Athens, the talk in the porticos sharpened to a point. The city had known hard choices since its first stones were laid, and it had never been shy of argument. Sailors who had spent their lives reading wind and wave spoke for caution. Younger men with fresh scars from border skirmishes urged the assembly to make a stand that would be remembered. The priests of Athena said that wisdom was not delay and courage was not rashness. The generals quietly reviewed the lists of oarsmen and the stock of seasoned timber. The city that loved reason was preparing for a test that reason alone could not meet. Through all this, the island fleet kept moving. One squadron took a line across the Gulf and touched at towns that had long paid dues to Athens. Another climbed the chain of islands toward the waters of Attica. They did not anchor under the walls. They lay at a distance and let their scouts measure the temper of the shore. A people used to being courted could tell when they were being weighed. The Athenians lit signal fires along the coast. They posted runners on the roads between Piraeus and the old city so that news would not go stale while a man caught his breath. By late summer, the lines on the council board had become the wakes of real hulls. The island had pinned the western routes and settled its hand on rivermouths and straits. It had scattered garrisons like seeds on hills that watched good harbors. It had drawn a circle around the lands that loved to argue about everything under the sun and asked them to debate the worth of their own freedom. That debate was about to leave the portico and take place on water and on earth where a spear, not a sentence, is the last word. Athens met the hour with a steadiness born of habit. The assembly filled the panics at first light. Men who had argued about stipends and road repairs the week before now weighed a graver balance. Messengers from the islands stood to speak of red-beaked ships riding just beyond the headlands. A pilot from a harbor under siege told how the blockade tightened each night like a rope in a rigger's hands. Priests from the Acropolis brought word that Theos smoke had risen straight in a still air and that an owl had crossed the city at dawn. It was not a promise. It was a sign that the city was awake. The vote was taken with speed. The generals were given full command. The triarchs who had long kept a ship at their own cost were called to name their crews and bring their vessels into the sheds at Piraeus. The poorest men who had no armor and no horse came forward for the oars. Athens took pride in that. A city that sets its humblest hands in the benches keeps a deep root. The shipwrights had stored good timber through 2 winters. Their lists matched the generals' needs almost line for line. Pitch was heated, nails were counted, sand was spread on decks so men would not slip in blood or spray. Drums were checked and spare drum heads set aside on hooks. The first business was to break the siege that had become a watchword. The harbor lay behind a bar that fooled strangers who did not know how the current ran at dusk. The Athenian captains did know. They put out with a small force as the light drained from the sky and let the tide carry them at a slant across the outer roadstead. They kept to the shadow of the headland until the last moment. Then the coxswains called for stroke, and the oars bit like teeth. The Atlantean ships near the mouth moved to block the channel. It was the clever move. It was also the expected one. The Athenians split their line and sent a third of the hulls to sound water over the shaw that only locals trusted. The lead triumphed. crossed the bar with a whisper of sand under her keel, and came on at an angle that turned the blockade into a trap. The rest drove straight at the guard and opened a lane with their rams. Marines threw grapples and boards. Fishers on the quay who had hidden in doorways ran to cut enemy moorings with knives that had cleaned nets since their father's day. By morning, the market heard that the strait was open again, and that the jars of grain in the customs house would be counted by the city that had built it. The victory was small on the map. It was large in the mind. Free towns sent envoys to Athens that very week. Some asked for garrisons. Some offered ships. A few sent only promises. The city took what it could use and sent back two things that matter more than coin, a posted timetable, and a pledged return. Predictable help builds courage in places where grand speeches do not reach. The island did not take the cut easily. The second wave had come in. Strength and had meant to camp on the mainland as a sign that the old world was finished. The chosen beach was a flat reach east of the city where a stream slid into the sea over a bed of pebbles. Behind it lay a low slope with fields gone to stubble and a shrine on a knoll. The spot was tidy and practical. It became the ground on which two ways of war tried to master each other. The Atlanteans landed with a discipline that no one could mistake. Ramps were set to the gunwales. Lines of Marines came down in armor that gleamed in the sunday. Slingers took position beyond. Spear cast and sent their first stones in a steady patter that covered the work. Engineers carried stakes and mattocks. They set a line of breastworks before noon. Officers walked the edges and placed. Men with gestures that needed no words. They had practiced it on drill fields under the red walls of their city. Now they were doing the same thing with the smell of salt and pitch in their noses. Athens met them with the old shape. The phalanx formed on ground that gave the hoplite a small edge. The center stood on the level where the soil held a firm step. The right rested on the brook so that a flank could not be turned without wetting a shield and breaking the file. The left was refused by a short distance so that it would not be rapped at the first crash. The front ranks were men of age who had felt the weight of enemy shields before. Behind them stood farmers and potters and smiths who had drilled on the dust of the academy until the pattern had sunk into their bones. The cavalry hovered on the far wing as a check and a threat. It was a simple array. It was also a hard one to break when the men who held it were used to standing shoulder to shoulder without torque. The first clash belonged to the slings and the bows. The Atlantean stones flew long and straight. The Athenian archers shot in quick volleys that searched for officers and standard bearers. Then the signal came and the lines moved. The Atlanteans tried to use their weight to drive a wedge into the Athenian center. The hoplites answered with the slow push that has settled many arguments. Shields overlapped. Spears thrust over the rim and under the rim and at faces when a helmet lifted by habit for a breath. The noise was like a door being forced that will not give. The stream on the right ran red where men fell with their feet still in the water. The battle bent and did not break. Twice the islanders pressed the center until the Athenian files gave ground the length of a spear. Twice the veterans in the front ranks took a half step and reset their feet and made the line whole again. On the left, the refused wing held under a hail of stones that bruised, but did not kill. On the far right, the cavalry edged forward only when the ground was sure and the moment had weight. A short charge took a handful of enemy slingers and sent the rest skittering back behind their line. Small gains count when the day is long. The turn came when the islanders tried to risk the beach. Fresh companies ran down from the ships to add weight to the push. The tide was in and the wet stones betrayed their feet. The Athenians saw the stumble and answered with a measured press that was more like a carpenter's hand than a berserker's shout. The center moved 3 paces as one. The spearheads bit and the shields leaned. The line of Marines that had hoped to arrive as a hammer met a wall instead. Officers on the island side lifted their standards to order a regroup. The standards wavered. A runner on the Athenian right splashed across the brook and shouted to the front ranks that the enemy left was stepping back. True or not? The word found tired men and gave them one more breath. The push became a drive. The Atlanteans yielded one pace, and then another. They did not rout. They retired to their breastworks and left the field to the men who had held it. The light failed on a field covered in spent shafts and broken spearheads. Each side counted its dead. Athens raised a trophy at the shrine on the knoll with the trunks of 2 young trees lashed together, and the shields of fallen foes hung on the crosspiece. It was not triumph. It was an answer. The island force withdrew to its ships under a guard that did not run. They would return to the sea where their officers thought the war belonged. The sea did belong to the island. It belonged to Athens as well. The fleets met at the mouth of a narrow strait. The signals flew from mast to mast. The Athenian captains kept their files tight and looked for the moment when a gap opened. Twice they performed the Daclys and slid a sharp beak between enemy bows, and shattered OES on either side so that a path opened where no path had been. When the islanders tried to answer with a wheel and a hard charge, the Athenians turned inside them and cut at exposed sterns. The fight ran along the strait all morning. Smoke hung low. The sea carried the smell of pitch and pine and sweat. Men on the benches pulled until their hands bled. Drummers beat time with a fury that kept order inside chaos. By noon, the water was a burial ground for broken spars. The islanders had lost rams and crews they could not replace in a month. The Athenians had lost ships. 2. They had also learned that the enemy could be handled when a captain kept his head and did not chase a kill into bad water. When the wind freshened in the afternoon, the Athenians backed to their anchorage and formed a wall with their hulls. Prows out, lines joined. The islanders weighed their chances and chose not to test that wall. They turned for open sea with the wounded in tow. Towns that had watched and waited now sent grain and men without being asked twice. Spartans who disliked Athenian ways sent hard veterans to hold passes where a landing party might try its luck. Islanders set light boats to shadow the enemy and send word by fire to the next headland. The web of small loyalties that had often frayed now held fast because the island had given it a common purpose. Athens paid for every lesson with blood. Funerals went up the roads to the Karamios in a long file. Names were carved. Mothers stood in still dignity. The city did not pretend that loss is a small price. It did what cities must do when they mean to live. It turned grief into a stubborn will. It repaired hulls. It trained new crews. It sent envoys to the freed harbor with a promise to come again if needed. It told its allies the date of the next master and kept the date. In the island, council's men who had spoken easily about destiny now talked of measures and months. Garrisons demanded grain and coin. Captains asked for Osman they could trust. The pillar in the red-walled temple at home still shone, but the words written on it had begun to sound like a warning, rather than a boast. Power that expected a parade had found a fight. A realm that liked to move by plan had met an enemy who could read water and time and make both serve. So the clash of cities settled into a long strain. The West held its ringed center and measured its losses. The East kept its resolve and measured the days until the next summons. Between them lay the sea. The sea remembers those who try to master it. It rewards the patient and punishes the proud. The next reward and the next punishment were already gathering beyond sight. The warnings gathered in small ways before anyone would name them. The warm spring in the precinct ran hotter for a week and then went dull. The cold spring took on a taste that was not stone and not iron, but something a tongue could not place. Fishermen brought home fish with strange lesions and found them in waters that had always been clean. Dolphins that loved to play in the ring water vanished without a trace. In the ship's sheds, the corkers swore the planks were weeping even after a fresh seam was laid. The priests said little in public. In private, they spoke of lamps that gutted on windless nights and of a hum in the stone under the temple floor that came and went like a distant cart on a road. The first tremor came at noon and seemed a jest. Cups danced. Door frames creaked. Children laughed to see the water in bowls shiver as if a hand had touched it. The ground settled, and men went back to work. The second tremor came before dawn and rolled through the island like a slow beast. Men woke and sat upright in the dark with their hearts thudding. Dogs howled in the harbor. A pile of spars toppled and clattered across the quay. At the canal where the watchman saw the surface rise against the boards and fall again without a wind to trouble it. Old men who had worked the fields their whole lives put a hand to the earth, as if greeting a friend come home from a long journey who was not the same man who had left. The swarm began that evening. Short jolts that rattled shutters, long breaths that made rafters complain. A low sound seemed to rise from the ground itself. A note without a voice. The earth speaking in a tongue no one understood. The kings sent runners to lock the inner bridges and to lower the harbor chains. The engineers were told to drain the ring. Water to its safe marks so that the walls would not be pressed if a surge came. In the precinct, the priests piled oil on the altar and kept the flame high. The pillar of red metal shone in that light the way it had shone in other seasons. It looked like a promise. It also looked like a warning that had waited a very long time to be heard. Night fell. The third shock struck with the violence of a dropped hammer. It threw men from their feet and sent tiles sliding from roofs into the streets. In the outer ring, the bronze plates on the wall rang against their fastenings like shields in a chest. A seam opened in a key, and the edge of the stone dropped the depth of a hand. From that gap, a thin jet of sand fountained up as if the island were a leaking jar. The canal banks slumped in places where the soil was soft. Barges tilted and fetched up against their moorings. The hot spring roared as if a cauldron had been set over a fire. The cold spring turned cloudy and spat air in angry little bursts. Then the sea struck, not as a single wall that a poet might sing of long after, but as a series of surges that were each worse than the last. The water in the ring basins ran out as if pulled by a giant hand and left the mud bare with fish flopping. Before anyone could make sense of that sight, the water came back and climbed the inner walls as if they were nothing. It fell again and then rose higher still. Boats tied fast on the quays banged and tore loose and spun across the basins. A triumph in the outer harbor broke her moorings and slammed sideways into a bridge pier that had stood since Atlas. The pier held for a heartbeat. It cracked with a sound that people would remember to the end of their lives and went to pieces that the next surge carried away like straw. Fires started as if they had been waiting their moment. Braziers tipped in kitchens. Lamps fell. In the palace quarter, a row of roof beams went down and showered the court with sparks. Wind that came out of nowhere pressed the flames into narrow lanes that ran with the streets toward the bridges. Men formed ranks and passed buckets until their hands bled from wet rope. In other quarters, the ground was the enemy. The packed soil in the yards lost its strength and turned to slurry that swallowed a step to the ankle and then to the knee. Walls that had looked solid in daylight folded like crust. A corner of a granary slid off its foundation and crumpled with a slow grace that made men gasp. The temple kept its fire. The priests carried the flame from lamp to lamp, while the statue loomed above them with its eyes turned to the distance. Twice the smoke hung in a still air. Twice a gust raced through the cellar end, made the torches lean as if a storm had entered the hall with intent. The oath court filled with people who could not keep away. The kings came without robe or crown and stood barefoot on the stone. Because the old stories said that the god listens better to a man who shows his mortal feet. They laid their hands on the red pillar and spoke plainly. They begged for time. They begged for mercy. The pillar gave back their words in a dull ring. Far below, something answered. That was not a god and not a man. The last hour before dawn tore the island open. The plain beyond the ring city dropped a small measure as if the ground had taken a breath in and forgotten how to let it out. Water rushed from the canals and spread where it had never belonged. In the ship sheds a long crack, ran down a carved door, and stopped at a hinge as neat as a carver's line. In the inner ring, a seam opened in a street and pushed a strip of pavement up into a ridge the height of a kneeling man. Men dragged the wounded over it, and then watched it sag again, as if it had been a living thing that had spent its strength. The wave that followed took the outer wall without a pause. It climbed the metal plates until the bronze went dark under green water, and then it leaned and went over. The force of it drove timbers through masonry and hurled a fishing boat against a facade so hard the stem stuck in a window. People fled to the central hill because habit told them that the center was safe. The rings that had always guarded them turned treacherous. Bridges that had never failed twisted and fell into the churning basins. Those that held were no kindness. They became traps where people pressed too many bodies onto spans meant for a slow cart and a pair of oxen. On the hill, the kings tried to make order out of ruin. They sent runners to open the way to the high fields and to bring water skins and blankets to the square before the temple. The runners went, and some did not come back. The streets behind them had changed while they ran. The king sent for the engineers to say which walls could stand and which must be left to fall. The engineers came with faces white from dust and told truths that no one wanted. The inner wall had broken at 3 points. The red plates hung at the edges like scales on a wounded fish. One of the drawbridges had dropped into the basin and could not be raised. It lay at an angle that made a slide for the next wave to climb. When the first light reached the horizon, hope lifted and then fell out to sea. A line showed itself that did not look like an ordinary swell. It ran straight, and it came on with a speed that tricked the eye. The water under it seemed to draw back and sink, as if the ocean had changed its mind about where it wanted to be. Men who had never known fear felt it as a weight in the chest that would not let them draw a full breath. The line rose into a wall that carried broken holes and trees and the roofs of houses like the litter of some vast journey. It struck the outer city and found no shape strong enough to confuse it. It poured into the rings and turned them into drums. Water slammed against stone and came back and met itself and leaped again. The noise was beyond thunder. It was a continuous tearing that drowned voices and thoughts alike. The temple took the blow. Columns stood and then leaned as if listening to something in the earth. A corner of the roof went and let daylight fall into a place that had never welcomed it. The statue of the god watched the fall and did not move. The priests did not leave their post until the floor heaved under them, and the dark line of a crack ran between the altar and the pillar. The pillar trembled. A plate shifted with a metallic cry, and then another. The old men who had rubbed oil into those plates for years tried to brace it with their hands, as if it were a living brother. The second surge took them and washed them against the far wall. When the water lowered for a breath, the pillar still stood. A heartbeat, laid to the floor under it, gave way in a block the size of a small house. The pillar slid and vanished into the blackness with a sound like a bell buried in sand. The central hill became an island on an island. People stood in the thinning crowd and looked about in a daze. Some spoke the names of children. Some prayed without sound. Some stared at the red plates torn from the inner wall and strewn like fallen leaves. A group of soldiers formed a cordon and held a stair that still led down to a patch of dry ground. They moved people past them with care and did not look up when the next shock set dust sighing from the cracked stone above. Out on the plain, the order that had taken generations to make unmade itself in an hour. The field terraces slumped. Canals burst their banks and cut new channels that did not respect a boundary or a record. Storehouses that had been measured to the finger width came apart in slow waves as the soil under them lost its strength. In the distance, hills that had always been blue with age took on a sharpness that made them look young and angry. Great stones let go and bounced in long arcs that harvested groves the way a farmer harvests grain. The sea did not stop. After the greatest surge came lesser ones that found new paths. They ran through streets and pulled people from doorways and tossed them on heaps of timber that had been walls a moment before. The last wave of the morning came as a long rise that did not foam. It lifted everything still afloat and moved the wreckage as if it weighed nothing. When it fell back, it left boats perched on balconies and a triumph laid across two fallen houses like a bridge built by a giant in a hurry. Then there was quiet, not peace. The quiet of a city whose voices have been taken. Smoke rose in thin lines from damp fires that would not go out and would not warm a hand. The smell was salt and ash and the sweet stink of crushed grain and the sour tang of mud from the bottom of canals. Birds were gone. Dogs stood and trembled or lay down and did not rise. The sun climbed and showed what it could show and took from no one the sight that it showed. By noon the central hill and a few higher rises still stood above water. The rest of the ring city was a confusion of broken stone and flooded courts and channels that now belonged to the sea. The outer plain lay under a sheet of brown that moved with a lazy malice. The harbor mouth had shifted. The bar had opened into a channel where none had been and had closed where the old pilots trusted it most. The ship sheds were broken boxes. The ring bridges were teeth in a jaw knocked out. Of true, the red metal that had once gleamed on the walls lay in torn plates and twisted strips that caught the light and made hard, bright lines in a landscape of ruin. Survivors began to move with a purpose that grief delays but cannot defeat. They gathered the living and carried the wounded to the highest stones. They made litters from door planks and poles. They counted children out loud so that the counting would not stop. Sailors who still had boats brought them up to the new edges of water and took people off in loads that seemed too small for the task. Engineers marked in charcoal on broken walls where the ground still bore weight and where it would swallow a foot. The kings held the square before the temple with a handful of guards and the calm that comes to some men when nothing else is left to lose. They did not pretend that Atlantis could be saved. They began to save Atlantis. Toward evening, the tremors faded into a restless shiver. The sea still moved, but without malice. A hush fell that had nothing to do with reverence. It was the silence that follows a voice that has shouted itself. People looked to the horizon without knowing what they hoped to see. There was no help coming from that direction. The only help was what their own hands could make before night came and took even the little warmth that ruin holds. So the island that had been a measure to itself became a lesson to others. It had lived in circles. It was dying in circles. Concentric rings of water and stone. Now concentric rings of mud and wreckage that would harden into bars where ships would run ground for generations and curse a name that had turned into a shaw. Dawn found the city stripped to its bones. The storms in the earth had eased to a tremble that set dust, whispering down broken walls. Smoke rose from damp fires that would not catch. The sea moved without a crest, a slow heave that pushed wreckage against every surviving stair. The kings stood in the square before the fallen temple and chose the work that must be done. They sent men to the highest stones with water skins and blankets. They sent boys with chalk to mark the safe paths. They sent the old to sit where their voices would steady the counting and the naming. The order was plain. Save the living. Do not fight the sea. Do not hunt treasure. Every hand that could carry was set to the litters. Every boat that could float was turned into a ferry and put to the hill where the ground still held. The island learned the taste of loss. In the first hour, the cold spring ran brown. The warm spring went silent. The systems that had kept dry years from becoming famine were cracked and fouled. Women tried the water with their lips and shook their heads. Farmers walked to the edge of the plain and looked at their fields under a sheet of mud. They saw their terraces flattened and their orchard rows torn into crooked lines that led nowhere. They found cattle with string cut into their legs where tether lines had tightened in the rush. They opened the throats of the wounded beasts because mercy was the only thing left that could be done well. Scribes set up a board on 2 broken drums and wrote the names of those who had come up from the rings. The list began in order and became a scatter of nicknames and half-remembered households. A woman gave 3 names and then put her head in her hands and would not speak again. A boy asked a soldier to tie a strip of cloth around his arm so that he could be counted as a bearer and not as another mouth. A priest took the small images from the household shrines and set them in a row on the temple steps, as if people could find their courage more easily if it had a face. Engineers walked the shattered bridges with poles to test the footing. They crossed with the care of men who have learned to hate surprises. They marked a simple map on a wall with ash. 1 path down, 1 path out to the only stair that still reached a jetty. 1 place where a boat could come in without breaking its ribs. They set crews to clear that lane with levers. Stones were eased aside. Tangles of beams were given to the saw. Work moved because men who are used to order can still find it in ruin if the orders are short and the hands are many. Boats came and went until the oarsmen could not feel their fingers. A line of small craft grew at the edge of the new water. Fishers brought skiffs. Pilots brought light boats with sharp prows. The last serviceable triumph was dragged around a bend that had not existed the day before and grounded on stones that had been aligned to the market. The crew tied her stern to a fallen cedar and laid planks from her deck to the shore so that the wounded could be passed up and down without slipping into the cold mess below. Mothers handed their children to men they did not know and watched them vanish into a crowd that was moving on faith. A runner with a deep cut came back from the lower rings with word that a pocket of houses had held on a knoll like a ship's island and that a dozen people were waving cloth from its roof. A team took ropes and went to fetch them. The team returned with 9. By midday, the hill was a camp. Poles and mats made lanes where there had been a court. Fires were coaxed with sea drift and broken furniture. A boy who had spent his life tending goats became a cook by force of will and made a thin broth from grain scraped out of a burst jar. There was no salt. No one complained. A physician who had learned to set bones after falls on. The quarry slope worked without stopping. He used wine on his knives until there was no wine left, and then used hot water. He told a tired soldier to hold a child's arm, as if it were the only plank left of a ship. The soldier held. The island still moved. The ground shifted in small jerks that made men sway without noticing. A sound like distant thunder came out of clear air at intervals that had no pattern. The sea level would fall in a way that made the harbor look as if it were exhaling. It would rise again and move over the broken streets without hurry and without pity. To the west, a ridge that had always stood like a patient ox dropped the height of a house and left a scar of raw rock that looked new and angry. Toward afternoon, the sea drew back farther than it had before and showed the bones of the rings like ribs in a ruined chest. The stone mouths of culverts gaped, dry for the first time since their making. Fish lay panting in puddles with their sides marked by the prints of hands that had tried to throw them back to a safety that no longer existed. Men ran into the mud to rescue what they could. They came back with a table and a cradle and a chest with iron bands that held when every other binding had failed. The last surge of the day came on them while they were still in the muck. It rolled them toward the hill and left them coughing and covered in clay. The chest opened and held nothing but a book whose wet pages clung to one another like dead leaves. The kings looked out over this and saw that the island would not hold another night. The earth had broken its bargain. The canals had become inlets. The streets had become channels that would invite the sea back with every shift of wind or moon. They sent messengers to the outlying islands and to the little harbors down the coast with orders to bring every boat and to bring food and to leave the old ties to place behind. They told the guards who had survived to point the way to the boats and to push people aboard until there was no one left who could move. A city that loves itself must learn to love its people more when the time comes. A quiet act spoke for the rest. The last priest who had strength enough to climb the broken steps went to the place where the pillar had stood. He took a handful of oil from a cracked jar and poured it over the edge where the floor had fallen into darkness. He said the names that had built the island from a hill and a spring. He asked for nothing. There is a point beyond asking when men who believe simply speak because it is what they know how to do when there is nothing else to do well. The sun sat low when the final turn began. Out to sea a broad slope grew where the surface should have been flat. No foam showed on it. It advanced without a crest. The ground under the hill thrummed like the plucked string of a vast instrument. Stones knocked together underfoot with a sound like teeth. A deep breath ran through the island again, and this time it did not exhale. The central hill sagged a hand's breadth. Then another cracks chased one another through paving and running children screamed because the lines were fast and unpredictable and cut across the safe places they had learned in the morning. Boats pushed off as the water came for them. The last try slid and took a load that covered her deck from bow to stern. The oars dug, a skiff capsized, and swimmers were pulled aboard by hands that could not tell kin from stranger. The slope of the sea became a face. It lifted the outer rubble and poured it over the near ruins as if the island were a valley between hills made of water. The last of the inner wall went in 3 quiet stages. First, the clamps popped. Then the plates peeled like bark. Then the core folded and leaned and dropped out of sight without a splash because the hole that took it opened down and did not want to be troubled with noise. From the decks beyond the reach of the fall, men saw a sight that would live in the mouths of their grandsons. The hill that had held the temple did not topple. It settled as if a giant hand had laid weight upon it. It went down until the roofs that the sea had spared in the morning sank from sight. It went down until the tips of the tallest columns were level with the swells. It went down until a square of red stone that had once been a threshold rose like a buoy and then vanished as if pulled. There was no island left to be reached. There was only a brown boil where the city had stood and a belt of water, so thick with silt and timber and the churned guts of the earth that a ship could not pass without losing her rudder and her will. Night came without stars. The smoke and the breath of the sea made a low roof over the boats. Men pulled until they could not lift their hands, and then lay along the benches with their chests heaving while others took their places. Fathers counted children by touch. Mothers held mouths close to ears and spoke into them so that the words would not be lost in the wash. The kings had given up the idea of being kings. They moved through the boats as bearers and water carriers and gave orders only when the orders were simple and would save a life in the next breath. That is what a crown is worth when the ground will not stand. At first light the water lay over a plain that had not been there before. It was not deep. It stretched to the near horizon with small heaves that showed the slow breath of a tired world. Pieces of walls stood like teeth in the gums of a drowned jaw and then fell and were gone. The boats edged around the margin of this new thing and found no channel through. OES struck bottom where no bottom had been. When a captain tried to force away, he found his oars seized by mud that clung like hands. The sea beyond the brown belt looked blue and harmless. The belt itself was a trap that would hold wreckage for days and then let it drift out in handfuls to remind the living of yesterday. By noon, the boats that had kept their distance struck out for the nearest outer islets and for the small harbors that had sent there craft without asking for permission. The first landings were more relief than welcome. The newcomers came off the boats in a silence that was worse than wailing. They drank water with both hands. They lay down on the first clear ground, and slept with their faces pressed into it, as if they meant to force the earth to keep them. The people of those places did what people do when they are decent. They brought bread and shared it in slices that were thinner than they would have liked. They found dry cloaks. They counted the children and the old. They asked no questions that would start a death over again in the telling. In the weeks that followed, ships from other coasts approached the place where the island had been and turned away. The passage that had once been a straight road between the pillars and the sunrise waters was clogged with a mat of silt and broken stone that dulled the sea to the color of clay. A helmsman could see a blue line beyond and could not reach it. A lead line sank and came up slick with mud. The Shah moved as the swells moved and made liars out of charts. Captains cursed and set more lookouts and marked their maps with warnings in heavy hand. No one spoke the name that the island had given to ocean and to empire. They called it the shallows. They called it the brown water. They said there is a place in the western sea where good pilots refuse good coin. The survivors began to turn from shock to work. Scribes who had lost tablets still remembered how to tally. They set up rough boards and wrote names and trades and debts that would be forgiven because there had been a night when all debts had been paid at once. Masons taught island ways of fitting stone in courses that would take a sea. Engineers showed how to lay a ditch and a bank that would drain a field and not turn to soup when the river swelled. Smiths made small things first because small things save time. Hooks and nails and pins and rivets. When the work grew, they made locks and hinges and clamps. The red metal that had once covered the inner wall now flashed in thin lines on a brooch or a blade. A last echo of a city that had taught itself to be careful and had then forgotten how to stay so. Some men carried stories longer than any tool. A pilot who had watched the last sinking from his deck sat in a tavern on a Greek island and drew what he had seen with a charcoal on a plank. He drew circles and lines and a high hill in the center. He drew bridges and a canal and a great gate with plates that shone. He pushed the plank away and said that a man who tries to hold the sea learns what the sea thinks of hands. A priest told a clerk in a river city that the pillar had gone down ringing like a bell. The clerk wrote the line in a margin without comment because scribes have long practice in writing the words of men who are trying to make sense of grief. A king without a seat told his daughter that the law is not a stone. It is the way a people remind themselves of who they are when the ground fails. She nodded because children who listen to such words grow up into people who go on. In time, the new coasts learn to set their own rules for the belt of brown water. Captains brought soundings from the edge and argued in market talk about whether the line moved with the season. Fishermen warned young men against the temptation to hunt the Shah for lost metal. Good boats were lost to greed. A shrine rose on a headland where the last bright plate sometimes showed at sunset like the fins of a red fish no one had ever seen before. People left a handful of grain there when they had enough to leave any gift at all. They said it was not to feed a god. It was to feed their own memory. So Atlantis passed from place to story. The earth turned on the night it chose, and the sea finished the work by morning. The city that had been a circle became a stain on a chart, and then a caution on a pilot's tongue. The people who had been Atlanteans became farmers and sailors of other coasts. They built with the habits they could carry. They spoke their names over new cradles. They told their children that a good wall shines when it is clean, and that the shine is only a sign. The strength lies in the stone and in the hand that keeps it true. The story did not drown with the city. It changed into voices and set out across the water in the mouths of sailors who had seen the mud belt with their own eyes, and in the memories of families who learned to live under other hills. A pilot drew circles on a tavern table with a wet finger and told a fisherman that somewhere beyond the pillars there had been a harbor with rings of water and rings of stone. A priest laid a small figure of a sea god on a new altar far from home and whispered a prayer for the pillar that had rung like a bell when it fell. A girl who had slept on a boat that night grew old and told her children that order kept a people alive, and that pride drew the sea into a city like a knife into a sheath. The facts frayed, the shape held. Generations later, a Greek lawgiver went looking for old wisdom in a land that kept good records. Solon sailed to Egypt in the years when he had set Athens in better order and wanted to see how other peoples kept their balance. The priests of the Delta counted their years on temple walls. They had learned to write when Greek towns were still arguing about how to measure a field. In the city of Sai, in the temple of the goddess whom the Greeks took to be Athena, an old priest received Solon and listened while the visitor spoke of floods and fires and the way misfortune burns a library down to ash. The priest smiled at the courtesy and then gave the Greek a lesson meant for a friend. You Greeks, he said, are always children. You remember the last catastrophe, never the ones before it. Your cities lose their records to flame and to water, and so your memory never grows old. There in Sai, the priest unfolded a tale that he said came from the oldest lists kept in their halls, long before the days that any Greek could name. There had been a great island beyond the straits that marked the end of the inner sea. It lay in the ocean where the setting sun sleeps. It was rich and it was strong. Its kings were 10 in number, brothers by ancient descent. Its fields gave more than their share. Its mines yielded a red metal that held its color in sea air. Its city had a ringed harbor and a temple to the sea god where bulls were hunted for the oath. In those years, the island sent its fleets out along the western road and down the coasts of the Middle Sea. It took cities under its protection and then under its heel. It set its hand on the mouths of the river country. It turned its attention at last to the shores of Greece. The priest told Solon that in those far years, a city of Athena had stood against the Western power. It had not yet taken the shape that Solon knew, but it had the same temper. It loved order and measure. It would not bend. Alone among the Greeks, it met the invaders in field and harbor and sent them reeling. It freed the towns that had been seized. It humbled the pride that had come too far east. Then the earth rose and the sea came in, the western island and the plain. Around it were swallowed in a single day and night of misfortune. Where a passage had been, there was a shaw of mud that blocked the way for ships that loved deep water. Solon made notes. He planned a poem. He asked for names and for numbers. The priest gave him years counted in thousands that would make a modern mind blink. 9,000 before Solon, he said, and the Greek scratched the figure in wax because he meant to weigh it later and give it a poet's frame. He listened for more detail and found it. A city built in rings, bridges, and canals. Walls faced in gleaming metal. 10 kings meeting at a sacred bull hunt and swearing by the pillar in the temple. Laws written on a red column. Splendor that turned from discipline to boasting and then to greed. The story had the look of a moral and the smell of an old record as well. Solon brought the tale home and passed it to his kin. He did not finish the poem. He had laws to defend and enemies to fight, and an old age too. Meet with a clean name. The tale did not die for lack of verse. It went from Solon to Dropes, and from Dropes to Critias the elder, and from the elder to a younger Critias who would sit in the company of Socrates. These are the links as they are told by the men who like to set their chains in order. In the time of Plato, in the days when Athens was arguing with itself and with everyone else, the story came to a young man who thought with a clarity that made other men uncomfortable. He had the habit of turning a tale into a mirror and asking what a city sees when it looks at itself. Plato chose to shape the old Egyptian lesson into 2 conversations. He called the first Timus for a philosopher from Italy who spoke about the making of the world and the soul of it. He called the second Critias for the man who had heard the story in his family and could give it flesh. A setting was laid. Socrates asked for a story that would show the virtues of a well-ordered state. The guests offered one from the distant past. A city of Athena, sober and brave, faced a power that had fallen from its first measure. The details came in a flood that sounds like memory and, like invention, a square plain beyond the city, crossed by canals set a 100 stat apart. A harbor with rings of land and water linked by bridges wide enough for chariots. Walls clad in bronze and tin. And a red metal that could be polished bright and did not tarnish. A temple to the sea god where a statue stood in a chariot with horses that climbed a wave. Plato let Critias tell how the 10 kings sat as brothers and judged under laws etched on a red column. He let him describe hunts and feasts and the cold ritual of justice when a king failed the oath. He gave the island prosperity enough to tempt the soul. He had the voice in the dialogue say that the divine portion in the rulers grew thin with the generations and that the human portion swelled. Virtue gave way to appetite. Justice to greed. The gods saw this and judged. The earth shook and the sea covered what human pride had built. The first dialogue ends with the world set in order and with the promise that the tale of the ancient war will be told. The second begins to fulfill that promise. It names the river country as a province under the Western power. It names the shores of Italy as the border of their reach. It gives Athens an old age of excellence before the men in the audience were born. It matches the sweep of an empire with the still strength of a single city. Then the telling breaks. The manuscript that has come down to us stops in midline. The sentence remains open like a door half closed by a sudden wind. No third dialogue survives to bind the tale up with a neat moral. The fourth voice at the table never speaks on the page we have, because Plato left us only these 2 works. Atlantis stands in our libraries on a narrow foundation. There are other ancient writers who say a little, never enough to make a new story of it. A commentator of late antiquity says that a student of Plato once went to SC and saw old columns with inscriptions that match the tale. A geographer doubts and shrugs. A historian on another subject uses the word Atlantans for a people near the Atlas Mountains and means nothing to do with the island. A poet mentions a western sea and gives it a mood but no map. None of these lines can carry the weight that people want to put upon them. The words that matter belong to Plato, and they are framed as a lesson, not as a ship's log. What is the lesson? Plato was not a man to hide his purpose. He meant to place a mirror in front of Athens. He drew a picture of a city that kept its old laws and another that let wealth rule its councils. He showed a free people standing against a power that had mistaken abundance for virtue. He used the sea, which teaches humility, as the final judge. He left the story unfinished so that the argument could continue in the minds of those who read him. Is the island a real memory passed through Egypt and Greece across a gulf of years? Is it a parable dressed in marble and salt? The dialogues invite both readings and then turn the question back upon the reader. What kind of city do you want to live in? Which ruin do you fear most? The ruin that comes from an enemy or the ruin that comes from within? Even if the philosopher's aim was moral, the story sounds like a place. That is why it endures. Atlas has a temple and a door and a pillar and a schedule of oaths. The harbor can be walked in the mind from quay to quay. The bridges are set near enough for a man to see the faces on the next ring. The field plain is measured like a tablet. The bull hunt has a smell and a sound. You can count the kings and see their crowns hung on nails at the council when they sit as brothers. It is detail of that kind that makes a tale hard to forget. It is the same kind of detail that archaeologists later learn to distrust when it appears without a second witness. The Greeks kept the tale in their libraries. The Egyptians kept their temple stones and their habit of recording what a king wanted remembered. The sea kept its shores and its temper. Sailors kept their caution on the western route. The chain of transmission is not long. A priest speaks to Solon. Solon tells a friend. That friend tells his son. Plato gathers the words in a story about cities and souls. From that point onward, we hear our own voices more than we hear the priest. That is the truth of most of what we call ancient memory. It comes to us through one gate that stands open, and then through another that opens into thought. None of this makes the tale smaller. It makes it human. A people endures a loss and saves the shape of it in a story that warns against pride and remembers a good order. Another people folds that story into a dialogue about justice and the fate of proud states. Sailors add a belt of mud and the habit of steering wide. Pilgrims add prayers at a shrine on a headland where sunset sometimes throws a red line across a low swell. The facts are few and often belong to the philosopher. The echo fills the centuries. The flood went out, but the story stayed. It washed into new tongues and found new shapes. Sailors kept to the outer lanes and called the belt of brown water a snare. Priests spoke of a fallen pillar and the silence that followed. On winter nights, merchants drew circles on tables and argued about where a city could stand that close to the sea and live long. Time carried those circles from memory into books. The Greeks left the tale in a handful of pages that men would copy with care for 2,000 years. Rome read those pages and shrugged. The empire had its own seas to cross and its own ruins to explain. Later ages read Plato and wondered if a parable could point to a place. Mapmakers in the Middle Ages filled the empty Atlantic with islands that were hopes and warnings. Antillia, High Brazil, the island of 7 cities. These were not Atlantis, but they showed a hunger for a western shore that might answer an old ache. The Renaissance added confidence to that hunger. Francis Bacon wrote a new Atlantis with a house of learning at its heart, a cool dream of a kingdom that prized discovery. More than display, he did not claim to have found the old island. He used the name to mark a place where reason might have room to grow. Centuries later, a German merchant read Homer and found Troy. In the soil, Heinrich Schlien broke ground in Anatolia with a spade and belief, and his trenches did not lie about a city that had been sung for ages. That success did more for Atlantis than any sermon. If Troy could rise from a poem, why not Plato's Island from a dialogue? In the 19th century, a Minnesota congressman named Ignatius Donnelly wrote a book that gave the old story a new body. He said, Atlantis was the mother of all civilization. He said that pyramids in Egypt and step temples in the Americas were echoes of a single lost city. He said that myths of flood came from one catastrophe in one place. The book marched across parlors and club rooms with a strong voice and weak bones. It held a power that outlived its proofs. It taught readers to see connections where there were only likenesses and to forget that likeness is cheap, where human hands build with stone and water and faith. Other dreamers followed. Some folded the island into a tale of vanished races and cycles of rise and fall. Some dressed it in mysticism and spoke of root peoples and secret wisdom. In the next century, bad men cut the cloth of myth to fit their own tailoring and wore it like a badge. Atlantis became a tool for fantasies about blood and destiny. When the century ended, decent people were wary of any map that marked a perfect city in the far west. While the dreamers wrote, the seafloor gave up its secrets to careful eyes. Soundings and charts turned the Atlantic from a blank into a landscape. Marie Tharp traced the mid-ocean ridge and drew a map that changed how the world thought about the crust underwater. Oceanic plates were young in the scale of geologic time. The floor of the Atlantic had been built and rebuilt by slow fire and cold pressure. There was no room in that record for a continent that had carried cities in the age of men and then slipped whole beneath the waves. A lost island could sink. A lost continent could not. The ocean was old. Its floor, where the ridge ran like a spine, was young and restless and not a home for marble courts. Closer to the inner sea, spades and brushes had their own luck. On the island of Thera, which we call Santorini, workers clearing away for new houses struck painted walls under ash. Streets and rooms lay sealed beneath pumice and dust. Spirited marinados opened. The first lanes at Aquarii and Christos Domus continued the dig. They found a Bronze Age town that had been caught by an eruption of terrible force. Jars stood where hands had left them. Frescoes showed ships and lees and youths with fish in their grasp. The date of the blast sits around the middle of the second millennium before Christ. The plume rose high and the sea was beaten into. Long waves that reached the coasts of Crete and beyond. The palaces of the Minoans took their damage and later fell to other hands. The island in Plato's pages stood beyond the pillars. Thera did not. Yet here were rings of Calera and a city once rich in the art of ships and bulls. Many saw in that ash a memory that could have drifted for centuries and grown in the telling. Greece itself held a smaller echo. In the year when Plato was a young man, the city of Helike sank into the Gulf of Corinth after a night of earth and water that left survivors standing dumb on a new shore. Writers recorded the loss. Fishermen later said they could see temple columns under clear water when the sea was quiet. In our time, archaeologists found the buried city in the silted plain and traced its streets. A Greek could hear Plato and think of Helike as much as of any Western ocean. Other coasts offered other temptations. In the shallows of Bimini in the Bahamas, divers found a line of flat stones that looked like a road. It became a headline and then a legend. Geologists called it beach rock, split and set by waves and faults in time. Along the Strait of Gibraltar, a French geologist named Jacques Collino-Gira pointed to a bank called Spartel that had stood higher when ice locked up the sea and that now lay below waves west of the straits. He asked if a low island there could have carried a small people and a small pride. The idea had a clean shape. It did not find proof. In the marshes beyond the old mouth of the Guadalquivir, television crews walked on the flats of Donana and spoke of Tartessos and a city under mud. Local archaeologists shook their heads and went back to their slow work. In the Sahara, a round wound in the earth near the Adar is called the Richat structure. It looks like rings from the sky. It is an eroded dome of rock and salt. A geology lesson with a teasing face. No harbor, no sea. It gathers believers the way a mirage gathers the thirsty. Science did more for the legend than denial can show. It taught patience. It taught how lands drown and rise, and how seas heap sand where deep water once ran. It read the cores of mud for ash and pollen and the shells of tiny creatures. A quiet library that records storm and calm with a discipline that no court has ever kept. It showed that the Black Sea once rose fast into a basin where farmers had worked the river mouths. It showed that the North Sea had covered a plain of reed and game that we now call Doggerland. It showed that coastlines are temporary and that memory loves the shore because the shore is where loss is hardest to forget. Underwater archaeology learned to speak softly. It set rules for how to handle a ship that had died at sea and for how to treat a harbor that had silted shut. The work became slow and honest. Teams mapped and measured and brought up small things with great care. A shoe, a coin, a shirt with a maker's mark. They gave us ports that had been known only to texts and storms, and they did not claim cities where there were none. In that silence, the legend breathed in a cleaner air. Modern readers stand between two poles. One pole points to Plato and says that the story is a crafted mirror. Another points to ash and mud and says that stories that last often start with something that happened to someone. Between those poles lies a field of proposals that range from careful to wild. Santorini remains the strongest memory in the room, not as the island beyond the straits, but as a disaster that could travel in words. Helike stands as proof that a Greek had no need to invent the voice of the earth. The Atlantic offers shoals and banks that once were higher, and with them the thought that a small people lived where a modern chart now writes the word hazard. None of this gives us a street to walk. All of it gives us the weather of a mind that could hear a priest and sigh and think of home and of warning in the same breath. There is one truth that most careful hands agree upon. No archaeologist has found a site that can be called Atlantis without strain. There is no confirmed city that matches the scale, the plan, and the age as Plato placed them. There is no lost continent in the Atlantic for a marble empire to have stood upon. The sea tells us this with basalt and magnetism and a clock that ticks in lava. The island, if it lived at all, was not a continent. It was a story about measure and pride with details borrowed from ships and quarries and from the way men love to set laws on stone. Yet the old lines still stir us. A ringed harbor. A pillar that held the law. 10 kings who met in a grove and remembered they were brothers. A free city that stood alone. A night when the earth turned. These are hard to forget. They point at our own mirrors. They ask what we do when work turns into display. When order turns into comfort. When fleets show a face that does not match the words. Perhaps that is why Atlantis survives every correction. It is less a place than an instrument. We hold it up to our cities and listen for a false note. So the tale crosses time by changing form. It is a Greek dialogue on a table in the shade. It is a Renaissance island where science is a faith. It is a 19th century promise that one city can explain the world. It is a 20th century chart that says the ocean floor is a book and not a void. It is a trench at Acroy where a painter set a ship on a wall and did not know that ash would keep it perfect for 3,000 years. It is a family of refugees who made a shrine on a headland and taught their children to leave a handful of grain when the harvest was good. You can call that memory. You can call it myth. You can call it both without harm. What remains is simple. Pride is a tide. Order can fail if it forgets to keep the bridges in repair. The sea does not bargain. A people that survives is one that can carry its laws in its hands when the ground breaks. That is the last gift of the island that may never have stood in the West. It teaches us how to look at our own shores and count what would float if the world asked us to prove what we love.